So if I can pivot a little bit from there, you've alluded to the importance, the necessity of that personal kingship in my own heart, and then of the cosmic rulership of Christ the Messiah
Hmm.
over the cosmos. Zoom in a little bit, but not all the way to my own heart here. We've gotten used to talking about whenever anyone talks about the government, we all we all assume that we know what we're talking about in terms of the civil magistrate.
Hmm.
So we say the government, we put the definite article in there, and that's like the only question of what, federal, provincial, which government.
Yeah.
But as you hinted at, and maybe you can switch down that track. Government in the biblical perspective, in terms of what it means to be human, is has so many more
Hmm.
implications than
Hmm.
the state.
Yeah. Yes. Remarkably, if you just point back for just a moment to the identity of Christ and the promise of His government in Revelation 1:5, we're told that Christ is now the ruler of the kings of the earth.
That's right.
Why is that? Well, Psalm 2, Psalm 110 make absolutely clear that this messianic king is the governor, the ruler, the king of the nations, and he's the King of kings and he's the Lord of lords. And the angels are declaring this at the what we call now the Christmas season. And one of the remarkable things that's taught repeatedly in the New Testament is that Christ is seated now because of his death and resurrection. He's now seated at the right hand of God, at the right hand of all government, at the right hand of all power and authority. This is what Stephen sees there in Acts chapter 7. It's what
Mm,
Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 1 and Colossians 3:1. He's seated at the right hand of God. And that the right hand is the place of government, it's the place of
right.
authority, it's the place of power. It's a symbol of the place of absolute total power and authority. And this is precisely why Christ's victory over death and sin and so forth, this is precisely why he's able to send out the disciples in Matthew 28, the Great
Hmm.
Commission,
Hmm.
in terms of his total authority. So Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth is mine.
Yeah.
Therefore, you can go and teach and disciple the nations. And this recognition of Christ's total authority led to, in the ancient world, the beginnings of a new view of politics. So in the ancient world, in the classical world, the state, the res republica, the polis, if you look at whether you're thinking about the Greeks or the Romans, the city state, the political life of man was everything. The Greek philosophers thought of man as a political animal, and any salvation that you might hope to gain was through the state. And when the early church were actually preaching the gospel in the first century, there was the reality that they confronted of the emperor cult, where you offered incense on the altar to Caesar as Lord. And so this declaration of this new King Jesus, again, Acts chapter 17, in the first 7 verses there, you'll see that they were proclaiming another King Jesus, and
Hmm.
as such, they were charged with acting against the decrees of Caesar.
Yeah.
And that charge was actually true
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
they were declaring another king, and this birthed in the world a new concept of politics, that the state wasn't the absolute sovereign. The state wasn't the source and author of all government, and you weren't a political animal, but actually human beings were made in the image of God, and they were ultimately under the sovereignty and lordship and government of Jesus Christ. That was the claim. And over the ensuing centuries, the church became the first truly free, independent institution. It became the first independent government. outside of the state. A church is a form of government. We talk about church discipline. We talk about church government. Well, we shouldn't take that for granted. The arrival of the church in history, as we know it from the Book of Acts, is one of the manifestations of the kingdom of God, where you have now an institution other than the state that is recognized as a legitimate form of government in human life. So actually, you're right. What we're dealing with today is a radical reductionism that tries to reduce government to the life of the state. Well, what is the state? The state is only a territory, right? The state is actually a territory. It's municipalities and provinces and so forth, and nations. It's a territory, and in that territory, there's a monopoly on the means of force.
Right.
Right. So there's in a particular territory, you've got a unified public, if you will. You've got unified sense of public law. You've got a republic. You've got a public legal sphere, and that impinges upon various aspects of life. But it's only one form of government in our lives,
Right.
and the state isn't really the government either, right? The government are those that individuals who have been elected to office, whose members actually change frequently because of elections, because of retirement, because of all kinds of changes. So government is something that people take on as a trust to occupy a particular office when it comes to what we would call today the modern state. But you cannot equate the state with government in toto,
In a reductive
in a
way.
reductionistic way at all. The family is a government.
Right.
There's rules. There's authority in the life of the family. There's discipline in the life of the family. There is, of course, even before that, there's the self-government of the Christian individual. And the Proverbs tell us it's better to govern one's own life than to govern a city, right? If you can't rule yourself, how can you possibly take on responsibility for governing other people in a certain aspect of the public aspect of their life, the public legal aspect of their life?
Yeah, do you remember Andrew Kern, the classical educator? He said something. I was listening to something he said recently. What he does with the a boys class that he teaches, like teenage boys, and they've got this sort of call and response that I heard the other day. I really loved it. He said, "They say I am a king because I have learned to rule myself."
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly where government begins. And no government can enforce. No civil government can enforce laws that the vast majority of people are not already enforcing in their own lives. So once you get to a point where the vast majority of people aren't prepared to live by a self-imposed sense of government, of law, of propriety, of dignity, and so forth, when then having a police force is hopeless. Police forces and courts are there to address the small minority of a society that are unwilling to live by the law of the land. That's what they exist for.
And it's a minuscule minority.
It's a very, very small minority.
And it wouldn't. You couldn't. It would be totally unwieldy. You wouldn't have a civilization.
Precisely, and that's precisely why when you get mass delinquency, when you get the collapse of the family and breakdown of the family, you will eventually have the total breakdown of a culture. Because the individual must govern themselves. The family is a form of government, and there are other forms of government. Our vocations are a form of government. I mean, they govern us. I mean, you got here at 9 o'clock this morning.
Right.
Why? Because the vocation that we are in is a form of government in our lives. It governs us. The businesses that people may be part of, the universities or schools that we're in, these are forms of government in our lives. And if you're in one of those professions like law or medicine, then there are bodies that govern the professional standards of that area of that discipline or that area of civil, social, and cultural life. So there are a multiplicity of guilds and so on. So all of these things are government, and I think it's a reflection of the essentially statist, sort of radical liberal approach that most people have sort of taken in by osmosis, that we no longer make proper distinctions and differentiate correctly when we're talking about the different aspects and types of government. The sort of encroachment of the government, the civil government of the state into all these different areas is a reflection of basically the collapsing of a Christian perspective on government.